Good morning, and thank you everyone for taking the time to join our webinar today. My name is Michael Wang. I'm a principal with On-Prem Solution Partners. We're a technology consulting firm with a specialization in the digital media supply chain space. And today we're going to talk about a topic that's getting ever increasing interest. We're seeing more initiatives being moved around this, specifically around cloud-based production. Obviously, 2020 presented some impactful global challenges across all industries, but for those in the business of content production, those impacts were particularly severe because creative teams that have traditionally worked in person together using on-site systems suddenly found themselves turning heavily to technology in order to maintain business continuity. This consisted of VPNs, remote desktops, and maybe some cloud workstations and storage to enable remote productivity. So although these were efforts in this, that were a step in the right direction given the situation, it became clear that it wasn't a model that was going to scale very well for a number of reasons. Bandwidth and performance limitations are always a concern, hybrid environments, and frankly, legacy processes, some that required the movement of large amounts of data, perhaps multiple times to multiple locations. These were disruptive factors that would lead to poor user experience and decreased productivity. Now, when you couple that with an environment where production windows are continually tightening, these factors would understandably impede mass adoption of this particular model. So something that became pretty clear was this distinction between a working from home model versus a true cloud-based production model. Most organizations have already enabled some form of remote productivity, but the pandemic forced them to start thinking strategically about investing, or at the very least, exploring the possibility of a true cloud-native workflow platform. So what would a platform look like? What could that type of platform look like? Well, the vision of cloud production is to migrate the entire creative workflow onto a platform that's universally available, performant, scalable, secure, and easily managed. This would mean that as soon as media is captured from a camera device, it would be sent immediately to the cloud and work would begin there, and it would continue there until completion through to distribution. To do the work, any number of tools, software applications, virtual workstations could be configured and deployed in a virtual private network that would have access to that media, and the work that would traditionally have been done locally would now be done in a converged cloud environment. Obviously, that's a highly simplified and ambitious view of how things could work, but that's what we'll talk about today. We're going to discuss some of the nuances around cloud production. We'll talk through some of the benefits, the challenges, the components, and the maturity of the technology to achieve true production in the cloud. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists for today's discussion. We have three great participants, each with extensive experience related to cloud production. Collectively, their experience ranges across business strategy, process, and of course, technology. The format is going to be a simple series of questions that I'll be directing to the panel over the next 45 minutes or so. For the audience, if you have any questions along the way, please feel free to submit those in the Q&A window. We'll try to answer those within the context and the flow of the conversation. If we're not able to do that, then we'll leave some time at the end to get to those questions at the end. So please, if you have questions, please submit that there. All right, so I think what we'll do is we'll get started with some introductions. We'll start with Faisal. Faisal, could you introduce yourself and provide a brief overview of your background? And then after Faisal, we'll go to Hans and then Michael.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. Welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Faisal Mahmood. I'm a principal consultant with On-Prem. To introduce myself, I've been within consulting and the media and entertainment industry for 16 plus years. Over that time, I've worked primarily within digital media supply chain, looking at content from very early in its life cycle, starting with, pre-production and production all the way out through its variety of workflows, leading into distribution, consumption, and, eventually that, reporting and analytics around it. So I'm excited to join the panel today, and I look forward to having the discussion.
Thanks, Faisal. Hans?
Hi, everybody. I am Hans Baumgartner, a senior solutions architect at Tektrick. My background is in media and entertainment, and I have a strong background in IT. Primarily, I've been working on a lot of projects involving migrating to the cloud. How exactly can we do post-production in the cloud, and as well as everything orbiting around that that you would be required to do something in cloud production.
Great, thank you. And Michael?
Hey, thanks. Welcome. Morning, everyone. My name is Michael Pinaro. I'm a senior product manager with OnPrem. For 20 years of experience working with creative teams in both media and entertainment and in the design space, working on product development and building complex creative workflows. So it's an exciting space. Looking forward to the conversation today, and glad to see we have a pretty good turnout. So looking forward to the interaction.
Awesome. All right, so let's dive right in. I think Faisal, if you wouldn't mind taking this first question. At the broadest level, business continuity is one of the more obvious benefits of cloud production. Can you elaborate on what that means and what that provides?
Yeah, so when it comes to the major studios, they've already started their journey into the cloud probably like 5 years ago. That's where we really saw a pivot in general, where the major studios prior to that point were very sort of cloud phobic. There was a lot of concerns around control of content and security. But then we quickly sort of saw around 2017, 2018, the majors start to pivot towards looking at cloud for their IT workloads, but then also some of their creative workloads. We saw the initial benefits for cloud related to scalable infrastructure, managed security and maintenance. Those benefits were pretty readily realized and adopted when we saw aspects of distribution, play out, file transfer, really the downstream processes. We saw those move to the cloud along with the IT workloads. And at that point, looking at the production and the creative side or upstream, some of the initial benefits were obvious related to infrastructure. However, there was a lot of built-in challenges due to the nature of creative production. With the studio model, the production is actually outsourced to specialized production companies who have the resources and the capabilities to produce the creative elements. That's not an in-house capability within the studio. So that's where, from a studio perspective, they weren't really aligned to leverage their existing cloud platforms to move into production. As we moved more into the production company world and looking at areas of innovation, that's where we saw new benefits start to develop. So one of the key benefits that we're seeing with production in the cloud from a studio perspective is the ability to reach worldwide talent where they live. So this has obviously been amplified by the pandemic. However, even prior to that, the studios were moving direct to consumer through the subscription model. That was really being driven by a need for premium content. So the supply of talent was at was strained at an all-time high as these majors competed for these premium productions. So we've seen now, as working with the cloud, production in the cloud is being positioned more towards filmmakers versus studios in the business. There's a really key benefit around gaining filmmaker adoption because those are the stakeholders who truly drive productions. Getting a major director, a major cinematographer, a major production company to move towards the cloud is seen as an overall benefit for the industry because it really accelerates that adoption. Another area that we've seen benefits in that were sort of a little bit uncovered from before is, the cloud really enables streamlining of workflows. And so the workflows in the past, like subtitling or closed captioning, were kind of being done as part of general servicing. Now, using the cloud to automate those and do those in a streamlined fashion, they're serving a public good. So you're able to see companies like Verizon announce, that they're supporting automated subtitling on all content through their platform, meeting, ADA requirements from the FEC. So that's something that, now that provider can claim as a benefit they're delivering for their customers.
Now, Hans, I think you, coming from an infrastructure perspective, can you talk about what some of the benefits would be from that angle?
Sure. Some of the benefits are if you have a lot of editing decks right now and you need to renew your editing decks for a hardware refresh, the benefit is that you don't necessarily need to invest in all of this infrastructure, because as a lot of, let's say, providers of solutions in the market, they're saying that investing in all of this hardware is costly. If you can just outsource that to somebody else's care for this, infrastructure, then so much the better. Then you just have to pay access, a little bit of money, and then you have everything you need without having to invest in all of this on-premises hardware. The other thing, especially during the pandemic, at least some of you may have felt this, but the cloud turned out to be not as infinite and unlimited as we all thought. So that's what I can see as a business point, is that cloud providers also were not quite aware that, especially Azure, they were not quite aware that it was, could sustain this. And then suddenly the data centers are all used up in Ireland. So using that as an example, this is something that all of us right now are having to adjust and expand as necessary during a course, triggered by the pandemic. However, from the other benefit side of things is that as things have been moving more towards software as a service, platforms as a service, it makes sense just to continue along this roadmap and try to do more of it on this path. It's more cost effective long term, and you don't have the investment in these on-premises hardware. You don't have to deal with SLAs. You don't have to deal with software licenses and renewals and updates. It's just you pay somebody else to make your problems go away. And I think this is where we should be heading more into this direction.
What about the elastic nature and aspect that the cloud offers in just being able to meet the demand or changing demands or changing types of demands? Is that something that is an added benefit, or obviously it is clearly a benefit that we see or that the cloud offers?
At least from my side, what I can say is that the benefit of the cloud is that if you need to change hardware configurations just for a small test or a small render or something that's in specialized software, you can just change the instance type. It's really simple to do that. Just change it for the duration of what you need it for, and then downscale. You don't have to deal with trying to put together a small server farm on premises from computers that you have to do a test. You don't have to go and rent a computer or buy a computer or something like that. You can just scale your instances up as you need them and scale them down when they're not being needed quite so heavily. And that's the flexibility that you don't necessarily have with on-premises, unless you're, of course, running your own private data center.
Right. So, Michael, I think you've had a unique perspective firsthand from the client side. Can you talk a little bit about what you've seen from a client perspective, what they've been doing in this new environment?
Sure. I think, especially if you mentioned everyone's kind of cloud adoption over the past few years, and everyone coming to the cloud with their own unique kind of experience level and set of capabilities, even ranging from just, what is the cloud, right? So, and the production workflows are multifaceted, a lot of moving parts, a lot of different parties involved, extremely complex. And on top of that, each one is unique. So I think a lot of people are struggling with is, where do we start, right? What's the most logical point of entry And I've seen some activity around focusing on a specific piece of the production workflow, which is the offline edits. Kind of asking the question is, can we create the on-premise NLE experience for an editor in the cloud? So, things like latency become very critical kind of elements of that, right? Because if there's any bit of lag, then that's a deal breaker, right? So there's a lot of kind of technical requirements around just making that experience seamless, let alone getting that to work for multiple people, and then branching out. So finding kind of a place to put a stake in the ground. And then the thought is, like, if we can get one piece working, can we branch out from there? And then the question becomes, okay, where do we go next? Is it, camera to cloud capture, some of these kind of downstream finishing steps, or involving some of the other key partners that participate in that online or offline, editorial window, whether it's special effects group or some other related entity.
Just going to jump in there really quickly. Also, I mean, from some of the past, let's say the past year to year and a half, since before the pandemic, and then of course during the pandemic, as some of the client projects I've had coming in, it always first was just sticking the toe in the water just to test it out, to see how it is first. And for me, the first step to getting a sort of the customer more accepting to say, hey, let's put everything virtualized in the cloud is, well, what about the editing experience? How fast is it? How is the colors? Is it as responsive as if you're sitting right in front of the machine, so that when you drag your slider across your sequence in Premiere, that it has that same responsiveness? And the answer is, it's basically yes. And so using that as a starting point, these sort of initial client inquiries turned into projects, actual projects that had more software components in. But for me, that first one is, how does it look and feel? How does it function? Do I know that I'm using a remote editing station? That's typically the starting point.
Yeah, it's interesting. Now on the vendor side, I mean, obviously there's a need that needs to be filled, or a gap that needs to be filled, and vendors are moving in that direction. Faisal, is that something that you can talk about, what some of the vendors are doing to address this need in the market?
Yep, we've seen a lot of innovation in the last 2 years from the vendor marketplace, really leveraging the core infrastructure that's been, released by the major cloud vendors. So the vendors are coming in at the device level, at the application level, at the network level, and taking advantage of those, pathways to the cloud to streamline and optimize, and really disrupting a lot of the legacy and traditional production workflows. So from a vendor side, I kind of break it up into, 3 big buckets. There's, the bulk of production today is still live action, recorded entertainment. And so within those types of productions, you're either on a set or you're on location, but there's some level of camera and on-set storage that's dealing with those raw footage elements. So from a vendor perspective, we've seen the camera vendors, as they've continued to expand their quality of their cameras of 4K and 8K and other high-def formats, we've seen them also start to introduce Wi-Fi backpacks to the cameras themselves. So now, rather than having to manually move the files of the raw footage off the camera card, we're seeing those synchronized using high bandwidth Wi-Fi signals to that on-premise storage. So what that now does is it sort of cuts out a step of the workflow that was traditionally there. And once you have that file streamed to the storage, we're seeing vendors in that storage space also innovate. So that's sort of the second big bucket, is the on-set storage vendors. They're, they've always provided high-speed SAN and NAS types of arrays that you could roll out there. But now we're seeing them integrate at an application and network level with the major cloud providers, for example, like an Amazon Web Service in their S3 buckets. We've seen, certain vendors out there like Pixtor. They have a hardware appliance with high-speed storage that synchronizes seamlessly with a S3 bucket. So at that point, you can get into that cloud infrastructure and you can start to untap some of those workflows around editing and collaboration that Hans and Mike were talking about.
Yeah, that it actually takes us nicely to the next question. You mentioned some of the pieces like to get the workflow started, getting the content into the cloud to begin the workflows. Hans, what are some of the other key components to enable a cloud-based production environment? So Faisal kind of set it up nicely for once the content is there. How do you enable the work around it?
Sure. The few things you need there. So there's a few things. The first step is the tools you need for the editors to actually do their work. And the second part is what the IT administrators need to do to manage all of this, because it could quickly spiral out of control if you essentially have no one to manage this myriad of virtual machines, while of course ensuring your costs are kept to an absolute minimum, because it's a pay as you use type of system. So the less you use, the less your costs are. So there's ways to actually manage this better. So jumping a bit further into this, what you need to actually have is a system that has, for the editors, you need to have a good, reliable, let's say remote desktop experience, something besides RDP. RDP is great, but it's not the solution for doing remote editing. You need to have multi-monitor support. You need to have GPU-backed instances, ideally, if you need to have multiple monitor support. You also need to have Adobe Project Management or Avid Project Management if you're using Avid. And you also need to have a cloud scratch disk, essentially, to manage all of the storage in the projects. And this storage that you have should be as cost-effective as possible without needing to reserve storage space through volumes. Because if you're bricking or say blocking out 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 terabytes of EBS storage, that's a lot at the end of the month. But it makes more sense if you can use cost-effective object storage, but in a way that allows you to use that technology for the benefit of editing, which native S3 does not. So there's ways of getting around that. The other stuff that you need for an editor is to have a confidence monitor. So confidence monitor is what you would normally have to monitor on one screen sitting next to you, usually the output of your sequence. There's ways to do that using NDI tools, just to name one. That also needs to be there as well. From the management side of things, what you also need to have is you need to have file and workflows. That also needs to be managed somehow too. You also need to have image management, because if you're all spinning up these machines from one image all the time, that image also needs to be patched, updated, and maintained, so you're not referencing a very old copy of this image every time all of your machines get spun up. Because ideally, you would rather have these machines be terminated after they've been used at the end of the day and not sitting around. This will greatly reduce all of your storage costs for these images or these machines, because the volumes are not being blocked. If the machines are terminated and then provisioned every morning before, let's say 9 o'clock in the morning, when the editors need to start working, then you can really cut down costs significantly, as just one idea to throw out there. In addition to this, you also need to have a solution for quality assurance. So the QAs, the people who actually need to see the final productions before they're signed off on. So this could also include some sort of a shared collaboration between the producers and directors, as well as to do annotations or other notes that are necessary as well. Otherwise, if you don't have this, then of course you're sending files as securely, I hope, as possible to everybody to watch independently. But it makes more sense, since you have everything already there in the cloud, why not just have a solution that everybody, no matter where they're located, can actually participate and do the QA in these video clips. I think that's a pretty good start, I would say.
Yeah, you mentioned security. Obviously, that's going to be a pretty big topic, especially for the studios. Can you talk a little bit about how the content would be secured?
Absolutely. So the best way to secure the content is both at a role-based access control, which is standard. But the second one also is to ensure that even if somebody gets into your, for example, your AWS account and has access to your S3 buckets, you don't want that content to be easily read by a human. You want to have that scrambled and encrypted. That way, if somebody does get access to your AWS account, you're not completely out of luck. Of course, this doesn't stop ransomware. Of course, that's a completely separate problem. But the point is, if somebody just accidentally goes into your system, intentionally or otherwise, they'll never be able to read all of your files back. That's one way to do that. But of course, from a top level, having some sort of a software management layer, so like a platform as a service that basically will maintain the security permissions across the entire platform. Something centralized is highly important. It's not just, when you think of it, it's not just for the remote editing stations, it's across the entire platform, because ideally you're going to have applications and services such as, for example, the QA type of system that I mentioned earlier, the project management. All of this needs to be secured. And if you have something that's in the background, not just purely simply Active Directory, but if you have something that basically maintains all of these accounts across the system, this will make sure that you have essentially a zero trust policy in place.
Okay. Now, I mean, it sounds frankly very complex. Is this actually live in production somewhere? Is this actually someone actually doing this in practice today? And if not, why not?
The one company that just released an article on their tech blog was Netflix about 3 weeks ago. So because there is not an end-to-end solution that's being presented on the market today by anyone right now, besides one or two other companies that I won't mention their names here. But it's up to the people like Netflix, for example, to take it upon themselves to build it themselves. And they, of course, have obviously the funding to make this actually happen. But for smaller production studios that want to get involved with this, they don't have the resources to do it themselves. It's just crazy. So what we're proposing and what we're talking about are, a series of modules that can be used to build this today. So you're not stuck having to do it yourself.
I'll jump in on that on some of the challenges in the industry that are, maybe preventing some of the wider adoption from the production company end, is that traditionally the companies have purchased these hardware and software suites with the creative tools installed. And they essentially, utilize them repeatedly for multiple productions, farming them out to different projects simultaneously often, or running multiple projects through a location because the equipment is installed. And so those economies are well understood. The pricing and the business models are well understood. The capital investments are well understood, and they typically, are amortized over somewhere between 10 to 15 years, depending on some of the equipment. A telecine machine, for example, has a very long shelf life and, has a significant upfront cost. So that industry, has been doing business that way for, 50 plus years. And it's concentrated within niche providers, right? There's not really a major production company out there. There are large production companies, but even the largest is smaller than the smallest studio. So with that in mind, when you look at providers that are releasing capabilities in the cloud, like your Delettes, like your Avids, with their creative tools, now you're going to a pay-as-you-go model. And that really disrupts the business model on the production company hardware and infrastructure side. They're not really positioned to take advantage of those types of economics. They don't really, they're built to scale sort of horizontally, but they're not really built to scale vertically in an aspect. So we're just seeing, a lack of a leader in that space that's truly like a digital cloud first production company. Sort of you're seeing the Netflixes and the larger studios put up certain productions, in-house productions, tentpole types of titles on a hybrid type of cloud platform. But to me, when I look at sort of the timeline, we're probably a good 10, 15 years away from really seeing the production company side move heavily to the cloud. We're going to spend the next 5 to 10 years watching the studio do it for their major in-house productions.
Yeah, I think to kind of reiterate some of the previous comments too, and we heard kind of Hans rattle off some of the different components and vendors that Faisal mentioned involved. There's just a lot of moving parts. And one of the questions I think that comes up a lot and that people aren't quite clear on yet is, there's this kind of white glove service that happens currently, whether that's provided by the post facilities or some other group. As we migrate to kind of a pure cloud-based workflow, like who's going to fill that role, right? Is it one group? Is there one group that can do it? Or is it require kind of very close cooperation by multiple parties? Because, I think what everyone's after at the end of the day is to let the creators create and enable them rather than kind of, inhibit or, slow their process.
Yeah, also, I think it's, we're dealing with cloud adoption. I think, of course, there's the hesitancy of, will the things that I'm doing right now and my day to day, will that be affected by moving to the cloud? And I think if we can get as close to as possible, where how we're doing it today on premises physically is virtually identical to the cloud, and you don't have to go through any additional jumps or hoops or whatever to get into your space, your creative space to do your job. I think this is the most important thing. That's on everyone's minds when they're moving to a new piece of technology like this.
Yeah, so what about, we talked a lot about what the benefits are for cloud production. What are some of the things that we will not be able to expect it to do?
Yeah, I think when it comes to the gaps today, we've seen solid innovation and progress in, your live action editorial. We've even seen some key vendors introduce their color editing suites within a VM, but there's still a whole suite of creative applications that are still very much locked down, never mind to a VM, to a desktop OS. They don't support a server-based OS like a Linux or a Windows server. And even within the cloud vendors themselves, there's some cost and licensing implications for spinning up desktop OSs that really sort of run in the background headless. So when it comes to looking at, some vendors like Adobe, who's a major player in the space, they really, their public license for their video editor doesn't allow you to run that on a desktop cloud VM, right? There's a commercial challenge there. Now, on some of our projects on-prem, we've worked closely with vendors like Adobe, and we understand that, internally they're moving towards overcoming those challenges. So those will start to fall by the wayside, but it's almost like package by package, vendor by vendor, and each of those has its own sort of community of creatives and service providers behind it, where it's going to be sort of like a patchy migration. I don't think we're going to reach a tipping point there necessarily. We'll just see it almost move over project by project and vendor by vendor.
Yeah, I think too, that's why you've seen most people kind of, we talk about the question of where do I start? It seems to be a lot of the activities around that offline editorial workflow. And then kind of to enable that, it's the, camera to cloud, or how do I get the content to the cloud? But some of those final, we switch from offline to online, those finishing phases, whether it's final color, final sound, we've seen some developments, as Faisal mentioned, but those seem to be a little further off.
Yeah, exactly. I think what I don't see happening in the near future will be live production. I think it's all going to be post-production at this point. Unless the entire production was, multi-site through essentially live streaming to some sort of, let's say, cloud ingest station to growing files into some scratch disks. That's what I can see right now. But a full-blown multi-camera production of, you name it, Dancing with the Stars, something like that, I don't see this happening right now. It's going to be still done the standard way we've always been doing it. I do not want to say old-fashioned way. We're not quite there yet, but I don't want to use, we're not in anywhere going to be close to doing something like that in the cloud yet. Not unless we have faster LTE coverage. We'll have obviously faster Wi-Fi and of course faster on-premises connections to the cloud providers, but I don't see this happening anytime soon.
Okay. couple more questions here. What if someone is considering the move to implementing a cloud production environment? What should be what barriers or pitfalls should they be aware of in their planning process?
Yeah, something that when we were working with the studios that we found them challenged by was managing all the individuals that are internal and external to a production. Over the course of any production, there's potentially hundreds, if not like thousands for the largest productions, individuals involved in various aspects. And so being able to manage all those individuals and ensure that they're onboarded consistently, that their access control is centrally governed. There was a lot of sort of patchwork process and solution in place. And when you go to the cloud and everything's starting to get centralized, you can't continue to have that delegated security model. That doesn't work in a centralized environment. So Hans kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier on the infrastructure security side, where you have your role-based access control. And on the individual side for authentication, you also need centralized identity management on top of that allows people to authenticate, using a corporate account, to authenticate directly with your internal identity provider, but having a federated identity management system to handle all the different individuals that are going to need to touch parts of the production that are in the cloud. That's a key piece that we see challenge around, because the studios really aren't set up to manage those third-party identities today. So that's where you see solutions like an Okta being used to actually federate across, whether it's a production-only identity provider, plus your corporate, plus your third parties. And those could be something as, wide as something like LinkedIn. With one of the studios we did look at, could we use LinkedIn to handle third-party productions, right? Because everybody's sort of already on there. They have an OAuth capability. So there's different sort of I think innovations still to come based on how people at large are just adopting the internet to manage their identities.
And also, just to jump in, brief point, it's not just managing your identities, but in a way, it's sort of creating, let's say, using modern authentication protocols, an extension of your existing IT infrastructure that you already have, your existing domain controllers, your Active Directory. It's extending this into the cloud. You're not redoing your on-premises system into the cloud, you're just extending it, but still not completely turning off your control physically over those users or those assets. That's most important.
Yeah, and I wonder too, there's a lot of just general concern about losing control of either visibility or content. But I wonder, with some of these tools that have been discussed and mentioned in a cloud-based workflow, if there are real opportunities for increased visibility and exposure, and maybe possibly even improved custody over the end-to-end flow of the content supply chain, from both an individual identity perspective and a content management perspective.
Yeah, and I think that's actually where we've seen a lot of push for enhanced cloud adoption. So once the studios got on board with the cloud, within the biggest studios, there was actually the content security and protection groups that were leading the charge towards modernizing these technologies from an IT perspective, building a bridge to the cloud, but also leveraging cloud native capabilities from where it makes sense. It wasn't typically the broadcast or the engineering or the tech ops group, which are traditionally the champions of tech within the studio. We've really seen leadership come from all places, security.
Yeah, and I think in those topics specifically, the human element is not to be underplayed as well. If people are used to having physical things in their hands, whether it's drives or in some cases tapes, just getting them comfortable with the concept of it can be properly configured and set up, or should be even more secure in a cloud-based environment. So just getting people used to kind of working in different ways. That's not unique to this technology or trend at all, but still a very significant piece of it.
Yeah, and we even see on the production side, talent like writers or directors or even producers, they're governed by their union covenants, and the studios have to uphold those legally. And even within those, there's links to technology from a contractual perspective. So a script may literally be required to be delivered on a hard drive in order to release payment. There's still these, baked in legacy artifacts that come from the physical production world centered around Hollywood that, have to be dealt with in order to actually untap some of these cloud-based capabilities.
I think that was the same way a few years ago with the migration of SDI to IP technologies, 2022-2, 2022-6 and stuff. So it takes additional protocols and standards in order to make it a bit more flexible in the cloud. I think this is the same application you can apply to these, let's say, more soon to be legacy ways of handling things.
Yeah, it sounds like the need is definitely there. It's identified. There's some moves in the right direction, but there's still some maturity that needs to happen across all areas. And that kind of takes me to the next question, and it's my last question that I'd like to get each of your perspectives on. Where do you see this going in the short and long term? Like, where will receive? I mean, Faisal, I think you mentioned that there's a 10 to 15 year time horizon, but what does that mean? What about the short and long term of that?
Yeah, it's a bit of a mixed bag when trying to forecast out what's going to be happening over, let's say, 5 years and then beyond. I think we can pretty confidently say long term that, cloud adoption is going to become the new normal. We just don't know when that tipping point is, right? Conservatively, it's at least a decade off from even, reaching that peak. I think in the interim, a lot of what you'll see will actually continue to be driven by, core industry trends related to the business and competition. I think as content continues to be sold at premium prices, you're going to see larger investments in franchise productions, the types of productions that are going to span multiple years and spin off subsidiary properties, right? So when you have that long tail where it's the same characters, the same group, the same company, I think those are going to be, quickly moved into like a cloud-based environment because of their scale and their duration. It's going to make sense from an investment perspective to overcome the existing gaps. I also think the other trend that will continue to, sort of push cloud adoption from a business perspective is mergers, right? We're still even hearing about two of the biggest studios, not named Disney, potentially merging after going recently public with direct-to-consumer offerings at big fanfare and expensive launch costs, right? So just that there, where like these studios are struggling to establish a direct-to-consumer brand. Not all of them are gonna succeed and survive still. And I think those sorts of consolidations will then even push more pressure towards getting into the cloud, because now you may have two studios with different major cloud providers, and that'll push a whole another discussion around like, do we stick with two or do we stick with one, and what does that mean? So I think all these sort of like secular headwinds are going to push us to the cloud, but it's going to be a mixed bag.
What about you, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, I think we see there's still a lot of learning to be done. It's still you see a lot of concentrated POCs, tests, or very closely curated and watched kind of experiments, if you will, with with major players that have either the creative drive or interest and technical chops and or capabilities to do it, and they'll kind of lead the way. And I think a lot of others can follow from that or lead from it. But I think the one thing that's for certain is that the pandemic has definitely escalated or accelerated the timeline, whereas this was something that was an eventuality, that most folks knew that they would have to do at some point, has become, a closer or maybe more near reality at this point, where now they're scrambling to, how do we start to kind of find a piece of this, chain that we can kind of control, address, and maybe even operationalize now, as opposed to 5-10 years down the road. So
from my perspective, I think some of these, it's sort of getting away from having to use a full desktop solution in the cloud, even though it's, it's literally a background service that's running. It's the transition to microservices, to containers. It's something that, as a whole, the industry needs to sort of take a look at their architecture and realize, how can we break it up and do things simpler without having a complex desktop that essentially just blocks virtual resources, so much CPUs, so much RAM, even though maybe it doesn't need it 80% of the time. It's a reevaluation of how we're dealing with these things. But of course, with microservices comes also more issues too, where some of the vendors that I've talked to as well, they're still saying you have to run this on a complete Windows Server virtual machine, because the latency between the host to the container actually is higher on certain more latency sensitive applications than just being on a physical server. So it's this transition not only for the broadcast industry, but for, let's say, these container hosts, these container hosts in general. That's going to need to be changed too for these latency sensitive applications.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you for that, and thank you for the insightful conversation. I think what we'll do is we'll wrap up this portion here and try to get some questions. I think we had one question that I'm looking through it. I think, Hans, you're probably best equipped. I think this is referring to, the experience from the user or creative when it comes to lag and latency. Would you mind answering the question around what the response would be for addressing latency and lag for a user?
Sure, absolutely. So what I meant by basically yes is that, of course, I do in no way want to assume that every single home user has the correct infrastructure. However, the correct infrastructure that every home user would need to have is relatively light. So in terms of bandwidth, what you would need is simply about 50 megabits, which is good for one monitor to be streamed properly using the PC over IP protocol. If you need to have multi-monitor support, you're probably going to want to have between, let's say, blocked on download, about between 35 to 40 megabits per HD monitor. So you can scale up, you just need more bandwidth. But depending which part of the world you're in, bandwidth could be not terribly expensive. If you're dealing with, people have 100 megabit connections, 200 megabits. Some people even have direct fiber to their house, which I don't have, and I'm slightly jealous that I don't have that yet. But if you had direct fiber, think of how many monitors you could run doing that. Like you'd be able to run a couple of editing studios. So if you have a couple of people with one fiber connection, you could probably have each one running 3 4K monitors coming directly out of the cloud. In terms of, let's say, what is like can you possibly edit 4K, or is it only proxies? The answer is yeah, you can edit in full 4K. We've been able to pull, let's say, from some of the storage providers that we have in the cloud natively, we've been able to pull 3 gigabytes per second. That's gigabytes, not gigabit. So that's quite heavy, directly off of a 10 gig virtual network in the backend. So I think the better question to answer for you is, when you say, is it only possible in 4K, or can you only do proxies? The answer is, how much bandwidth do you have to upload? That's the best question. Can you only push proxies to the cloud for the editors, or can you push the full 4K high-res files? It's completely up to you.
I think there's a follow-up here for you, Hans, as well. At 40 megabits per second, what resolution can you transmit at that rate to display on a monitor?
It can vary. It can vary. So how the protocol works is that it only streams the pixels that update on the screen. So for example, if you had Adobe Premiere running and you have your sequence preview up here in full frame, if that is only editing or updating, then those pixels therefore are only being streamed to you, so not the entire screen. So that's why there's this, it could be from, let's say, 35 to 40 from my tests for an HD stream to one monitor, to 2K, so 1440p. let's say averaging about, let's say 40 to 50, depending on how much you're doing on screen. If of course, if you're running a full screen video, then of course all the pixels are updating. So therefore all of those are being streamed, but it kind of can vary. That's the best range I can say from my extensive tests.
I hope that answered your question, Sven. If there aren't any other questions, last call for any questions for the panelists. If there aren't any more, I think what we'll do is wrap it up here pretty quickly. Of course, thank you again for taking the time to join us here. We hope it was informative.